you for coming to the MUFON Sacramento monthly meeting. We have a very exciting speaker today. Douglas Dietrich is our presenter today. He is going to be talking about Roswell and the Rising Sun. His background is in document disposal for the government. And this is where he found a lot of documents and information and material, of which he's going to show you at the end, that is relevant to Roswell, along with a lot of other issues. And he put two and two together. Very complex issue, and after tremendous work, he has narrowed it down to the presentation for today, and it is unlike anything you have ever heard of before. It is impeccably documented. It will make your head spin. It has a lot to do with politics between Japan and the United States, and you're going to have to hold on to your seat. It's an amazing presentation. A little more about his background besides document disposal is also he was a U.S. Marine during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, has worked in private high-risk security and in civilian work in Iraq. He has also presented version of what he's going to talk to you about today on Coast to Coast AM with George Noory, Shadows in the Dark Radio, yes, and the Bob Oliver radio show most recently on Christmas night. It was an incredible 2-hour show. He is an advocate for the medical rights of elderly veterans and their dependents, and his educational background is in library science and criminal psychology. So, please welcome Douglas Dietrich. And Douglas, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you,
It's going to be awesome.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much for your patience, and thank you so much for coming today. I originally started off as a librarian's aide at the Presidio Military Base of San Francisco. At the Presidio Military Base of San Francisco, I was responsible for document destruction as opposed to document disposal. Document disposal is something I do on contract work with the state of California in this day and age, but for 10 years I was with the Department of Defense incinerating documents. And the problem that I had was that when I entered into the profession of a librarian's aide with the Presidio Military Base of San Francisco was that they had decades of backed up documents to destroy. And part of the reason for that was a complete lack of professionalism on the part of the DoD librarians that were working there at the time. And I need to remind people that the Department of Defense is a civilian agency. It is not a military agency. So what happened was that as a civilian on a military base, the Presidio Military Base of San Francisco, I was in a unique position where as a military dependent, a father who had spent over 30 years in the Navy, he served in World War II, in Korea and Vietnam, I had the lowest level of security clearance that any military dependent would have so that I could access the base. I could exit and enter the base at will, barring certain secured areas. But as for the areas that were pertinent to my job, I was given duties for document destruction that were well above my security clearance. And just to give people an idea about this, there are certain security clearances that are well above those of the president's. The president is usually around for 48 years. A general, for instance, will have a 30, 40-year career. His security clearance is going to be enormously higher than that of his commander-in-chief. So in terms of what I had, my security clearance was absolute rock bottom. So I am not breaking any vows of silence. I'm not breaking any governmental regulations and exposing what I'm doing because it was against those government regulations that I was given access to these documents in the first place. And in terms of the Roswell documents specifically, actually you can scroll that up to the dirigible. You might as well get that down to the bomber taking the parasite ride. What happened with the Roswell documents specifically was that on one of these days when the operations manager was confronted with the Presidio Military Base commandant trying to collate certain elements of the Roswell files for reasons known only to him, I was brought into the room to collate those documents for the operations manager. And I was confronted with what I thought was a joke. There were several, at least a dozen, footlocker-sized boxes. We're talking wooden and steel crates that were loaded with documents, apparently, loaded with debris, and they had a security clearance that was one that I had never seen before. It was like something out of a comic book. It said Crypto Cosmic Top Secret, and stapled to each one of those was another tag that said above. So this was literally above Crypto Cosmic Top Secret. So I told the operations manager, I said, I don't have anywhere near the security clearance to deal with these documents. Even if I open these boxes, conceivably I could go to jail for the rest of my life. And of course, his response was, Dietrich, if you don't get to work on those documents, I'm going to tell the MPs on this base that you tried to walk out with some of what's in those documents under your arm, and you will spend the rest of your life in jail. And of course, whatever protest I gave, such as, sir, I don't think, of course his response was, that's right, Dietrich, don't think. You work for the government. And at that point, I'm left with the unlikely task of dealing with something that I never should have seen. Now, by itself, it would never have made too much sense, and it gives me a perspective on Roswell that's extremely different from what everyone else has, not only in the sense of its connection with history in the Second World War, but literally in the sense that everyone else is looking at Roswell as a CSI image. They're looking at it as a forensic laboratory image, where they're looking at the aftermath of a murder scene, and they're trying to piece together the puzzle to find out what happened. What I was looking at it from was the perspective of the murderer. And I was looking at it from the perspective of exactly what happened from the inside out. And still none of that would have made sense without my working with literally reams and reams of documents from World War II for many years beforehand. But what had happened was that at Roswell, we had a huge Japanese superdirigible. And the superdirigible was well over 1,000 feet in diameter. The Japanese had well over a dozen of these operational in 1945. They were based in China. They had on them underslung super bombers, and the reason the super bombers were underslung was so they could get across the Pacific without using a drop of fuel. Once they got across the Pacific, the bombers would disconnect, and they could fly at will over the continent of the United States back and forth, using their fuel to expend, dropping biocidal weapons that would have killed an enormous amount of the population. As a matter of fact, the biocidals were fairly universal. They could be used essentially as an herbicide. They could be used to kill cattle, because since it was a combination of anthrax, which is originally a cattle disease, witch's brew of various other diseases. Some of the biocidal bomb canisters had different diseases inside of them, and each one of the dirigibles themselves had bomb bays. That was a universal feature of all of these dirigibles. We'll show you the diagram later on of exactly what was inside the dirigibles, which was about 8 separate balloons, each about 100 feet in diameter, and one central balloon that was about 200 or 300 feet in diameter. So they had a redundancy system where one of them could be destroyed and would still be able to float home. 2 of them could be destroyed and it could still float. 3 could be destroyed and it could still float. They had an enormous lift. Altogether with its own weight, we're talking about 265, 270 tons. And so it was able to carry the super bomber, several parasite fighters. Some of them were armed with rocket suicide torpedoes. Some of them were armed with cannon, but those were not the ones that were sent to the United States. Those were specifically for use in China, where all of these were developed. But basically, how that pertains to the Roswell incident as people understand it, on Friday, the 4th of July weekend in 1947, William Brazel heard, along with about 500 to 600 audio witnesses, an enormous explosion, so huge that in the middle of a thunderstorm, he could hear this explosion over the thunderstorm. He was not alone in that. Like I said, there were many witnesses. Suddenly, the sky lit up to whoever was available out there to see it, and one of the most pertinent witnesses, who is never really brought up in the Roswell phenomena, is 14-year-old William W. Woody and his father were standing outside on the privately owned land of Woody Farm, and they saw that flash in the sky, and they saw this flying craft that they knew was not a meteor because it was not as fast as a meteor, had a very long tail. The whole thing was burning. They saw it heading towards north of Roswell. They wanted to go see it, so they got into their flatbed farm truck. They drove over there, ran into a military cordon that was literally 20 miles long. And this is one of the things that blows to pieces any concept that this was an alien craft, because the cordon was pre-prepared. Everybody in the military was prepared for this. This was already something that they knew was potentially going to happen. So the military had a cordon set up. If there was suddenly a crash from an alien craft from another place that occurred like that, there is no way the military could respond that quickly with a 20-mile cordon. There's just too many men to coordinate logistically for something like that. So there was an ongoing test, and I can go into that in a bit. But essentially what happened was then after that, they had a number of witnesses at different areas, and every single one of these witnesses in different areas had a different body site. There were bodies everywhere. And so what happened was when Billy Mack Brazel originally, and that's the name they used inside the documents I dealt with. They kept referring to him as Billy Mack. When he was the first guy to run to the debris field on the Foster Ranch, one of the things that he said with the writing that he saw on the debris was that it was Chinese or Japansy. Those were his words. He knew automatically that it was Chinese or Japanese writing. So he was later intimidated and beaten and told never to say anything like that again. And later on, what happened was the young boy who escorted him, he had a young boy escort him to another, his name was D. Proctor. He was Willie D. Proctor was his middle name, and so Proctor was his last name. So Proctor escorted him pretty much the next day, and that's where they found the bodies and basically an atomic bomb. What they found was an object that was essentially the Fat Man. This is the kind of oval-shaped object that was fused shut with all of the burning that was not radioactive, and it didn't explode because it was just fused shut by the burning. All of whatever its internal mechanisms were pretty much fused shut by the intense heat that was caused by that thing blowing. And that's going to sound like a contradiction because of what I just said when I talked about all the redundant features and how hard this was to blow. It's because the Japanese prisoners of war inside knew how to blow it when the Americans didn't. And when they were forced to deploy that over American soil because the Americans wanted to see if it could carry an atomic bomb that they could deploy as opposed to the biocidal weapons it used to carry, then the Japanese would commit suicide. They would usually immolate themselves by venting all the hydrogen gas cells. And that's what you had in there, were hydrogen gas balloons within a giant airbag. Air is a gas, but air is obviously heavier than the hydrogen gas, which is lighter than air. So you could walk around inside without an oxygen suit, and you could patch up all of the hydrogen cells and gas bags as they became damaged. But there was no need to do that when they're trying to commit suicide. They're literally venting them all, and then they would light a flare gun. So the whole thing went up much worse than the Hindenburg, worse than anything you can imagine. The very suction of that firestorm in the air sucked up several bodies that were carried away with the burning dirigible miles north to Corn Ranch, which is where Ragsdale and Trudy Truelove saw the bodies and the crash, along with several archaeologists. The bomber itself, which was meant to glided for several miles, well over 100, because it was meant to do that, where it crashed into the plains of San Agustin. That's where several other teams of archaeologists saw it, along with Gerald Anderson, who was a civil engineer. The amount of witnesses is just enormous, but the one thing in common with all of the witnesses is no matter where they were, there were bodies. Because this was a huge craft that was crewed not only with multiple crew and the bombers, probably about at least half a dozen minimal skeleton crew, but you had around 24 men operating that dirigible. Now, why would the Americans let the Japanese do this rather than having Americans do it? Because the average Japanese soldier was 5 feet tall. The Japanese who were flying these planes and dirigibles were 4 feet tall. Most of them were recruited from the Yakuza because just as in World War II, when the United States recruited La Cosa Nostra or the Mafia, such as making deals with Lucky Luciano for information before the invasion of Sicily on what they could get in terms of Italian intelligence, what they could get in terms of breaking up the unions, what they could get in terms of patrolling the docks so that no one would sabotage any of the docks. The Japanese also used their underworld. So the emperor demanded that the Yakuza turn over as many young men as they could, which they did. The Yakuza is famous for another thing. During their cultic initiation rituals as they move up in the ranks, to apologize for the mistakes that they've made, they cut off their pinkies. So by the time a Yakuza is mid-range promotion, he's got both pinkies missing. Every single one of the controls in these planes is not only meant for someone with 4 feet tall, they're meant for someone who has 4 fingers. So there's no way the Americans could get anybody to fit in these craft. They couldn't even fit into the cockpits. They couldn't use children. They couldn't recruit dwarves because they had a secrecy issue. So unless they could find someone also who was missing pinkies that could operate these craft effectively, they were left with torturing the Japanese until they agreed to try and deploy it. And each time the Japanese would immolate themselves. There were over 20 accidents in the Four Corners region with dirigibles and bombers and weapons like this. So why was this going on so far after the war? What people don't understand is that the war did not end in 1945. What happened was that the Japanese government forces were still active in China. And we can keep scrolling up. We can give them a few more images, actually, just to show them how this works. This is the bomber itself. These are horrible. We're going to have to put these online where people can see this better. But this is basically what's known as a Kayaba super bomber. This isn't really what was deployed underneath the dirigible. What was deployed under the dirigible was more like a mantis shape. And we can keep scrolling until we get some of these images up. This is what crashed at Roswell's Plain of San Agustin. Obviously a different place than Roswell, but it's at the Roswell Museum where you get these diagrams. This was Bill McDonald. God, they can barely see that. But Bill McDonald actually made a killing off of making Roswell alien plane model kits. And all of them are based fairly accurately on what was seen by the witnesses of these crashes after the wings sheared off, various parts of the craft broke off. And again, what all the witnesses report, they would describe people with small eyes, pronounced small noses. They would describe all of these very bald-looking little men. And the reason for that was static electricity. Every single one of these crew members remembered the Hindenburg. And what happened on the Hindenburg, one of the theories of why it blew up was because the mooring line was cast down and the static electricity discharge went up to the Hindenburg and literally set it aflame. And the static electricity discharge you get when you rub your feet together and you touch a doorknob is 70,000 volts. But it passes by so quickly through your body that you don't feel it. But with something like that, the static electricity is just enormous. So all of them had shaved hair, every inch of their bodies except their eyelashes. Even their crotch hair was shaved. So when the people saw these people burned and with their necks, please, yeah, and with their injuries, then that's what they were doing. This is the Fat Man. This is what the Americans were trying to get up there. This is an American manufactured bomb. This is a plutonium bomb. This one was actually an Axis manufactured weapon, what we know as Little Boy. What it was made to do was fit in the fuselage of a medium bomber. If you stripped everything off of a medium Axis bomber, German, Japanese, or Italian, you could fit the Little Boy in there. And it was meant for that kind of delivery system. The Fat Man was tested by the Americans at Trinity. They never bothered to test the Little Boy. That was deployed over Hiroshima without testing because it was a uranium system. The Axis was used to working with it. The only reason they had it was because after the ceasefire with Germany, German scientists came over and they showed the Allied scientists how to build one. Then the German scientists sabotaged it. So by the time it got over to Hiroshima delivery site at Tienan Island, it started to fall apart. When they opened up the back of the plane in which that was being transported, the physicist who was there to observe it disintegrated. So all of the men on Tienan Island had to get together all of their metal filing cabinets, all of every piece of sheet metal they could find. They had to box it in. They had to get guys in there and try and resort it wearing asbestos suits as best as they could. Probably all of them got a huge dose of cancerous radiation. And then Alvarez, who was the physicist in charge of Tienan Island, had to load it with polonium, like sticking nitrous oxide in a race car engine, just to get it to work, because he knew it wasn't going to work. It was going to be a dud. When it got over to Hiroshima, then you can forward that. When it got over to Hiroshima, the explosion it produced atomic-wise was extremely small compared to what an atomic bomb could do. Despite all of the human suffering that it caused, which must never be forgotten, this was strictly terrorism. It did absolutely nothing to the Japanese war machine. Just like 9/11, no matter what happened to the Twin Towers on 9/11 or how many people were terrorized, how many people suffered, the American war machine didn't feel a thing. It was the same thing with Japan. This was a general who was basically in charge of the vast majority of the Japanese armed forces. He was in Hiroshima. He was directly under the blast. He survived. And he went to the emperor and he said, "It's nothing. We can take it and we can keep this war going." And the emperor agreed. And at that time, the Americans were still ready to drop the plutonium bomb. Now that worked much more effectively. That was a much larger explosion because it was all American manufactured. There was no opportunity for Axis scientists to sabotage it. But it was too late because at that time the bunkers were dug so deep that the real militarily valuable weapons that were being manufactured in Nagasaki continue to be manufactured. If you could go forward. So this is Area 51, what used to be known as Tonopah Air Base, but it had a different name from Area 51. Area 51 is simply part of Tonopah Air Base as it was at that time. That's a Russian satellite photo, but the Japanese knew where it was because they knew the Americans were developing jets there. Just to give you some comparison of what was going on, the Germans squeezed out hundreds of jets. The Japanese actually were able to squeeze out thousands by the end of the war. The Americans produced 4. And by the end of the war, these jets, which were the only things capable of stopping those dirigibles, were all in Europe, stranded across the Atlantic. So the Americans had nothing to stop the dirigibles with when the time that they showed up. And that's when the dirigibles showed up, landed at Area 51, where they knew technically educated people and scientists were there who would be able to understand the threat of these dirigibles, and the Americans were forced to sue for peace. That is the secret that they definitely wanted to cover up. They're willing to kill for that because they, in essence, at that point, lost the war. This gets much more detailed than that, but please, forward. This is the emperor where he was signing the documents to build more bunkers. He himself was in a bunker many times throughout the war. He often left his bunker and was never harmed because he was able to move in and about throughout most of Japan, survived all of the firestorms, survived all the bombings. We could switch to the next one. And this is what was being produced under Nagasaki. This is underground plant, UG plant. The Americans knew it was there because of the wastage that was piling up from underground. So the Americans knew Nagasaki had an underground plant. This is what it was like underneath that underground plant. This is one of the men that was running it. All of these were used to build bombers which were capable of reaching New York City from Tokyo. They were, anyhow, if we could go forward. All of these older women were working in those bunkers. They had been working there for years, so they were skilled, they knew what they were doing. After Hiroshima was bombed, Hirohito's intelligence pretty much told him that Nagasaki would be next because it was a major manufacturing facility. So he gave the orders to the munitions factory managers. He said, move the older woman up. All the young girls up there who are less skilled, move them down. And so they reversed they never questioned it because it was the emperor, but I'm sure they wondered because the young girls were less skilled. They didn't know exactly what they were doing. They hadn't been at it for years. But by doing that, he saved 250,000 young girls because they were underneath that bomb blast when Nagasaki was bombed. They never even knew the bomb went off. They were safe down there, and they were still manufacturing the Patsies, which were the planes that were capable of reaching New York from Tokyo. Okay, next, please. And this is what I'm talking about. This is the original Ki-77. It had two different code names to confuse the Americans. When Japan was 2,600 years old, that was 1940 in American years, they built two of these to reach New York from Tokyo to celebrate Japan's anniversary. Of course, that was before World War II. This was later standardized into what was codenamed the Patsy, the experimental long-range bomber. And again, that we have a standardized design for a long-range bomber that could reach America. It's not directly connected with the dirigibles, but it shows you why the bombs did not work. And the American high command was faced with the fact that they had basically blown everything they had in terms of a strategic failure. The atomic bombs did not work. Japan's war machine was still working, and the vast majority of it was still in China. Okay, if you could do the next one. The emperor invited teams of American scientists to observe what he had. This was the beginning of what was known as the talk-down process. This was in 1945. The American scientists were able to confirm the Japanese had chemical storage facilities. They had enormous power stations that had been so well camouflaged they had never been bombed. When the America went on the air to announce to the Japanese people that we must bear the unbearable and have Americans come into our country, the one thing no one ever seems to notice is that everybody in Japan was able to hear him. Despite all of the bombing that had been going on for 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, each year more intensively, all of their power was still up. So, next slide, please. So what we have here is what else the Americans found. Japanese jets. The Japanese, turned out it had thousands of jets. They were hidden in cave systems. Turns out the Japanese had radio-guided missiles that they could use to destroy ships. They had radio-guided bombs. This was the early version of what you would call an anti-aircraft missile, very similar to what the Vietnamese used to use to take down American planes over North Vietnam. So the American days of free-ranging bombing were just about to end. Every single wave of B-29s that they were going to send over from now on would be meeting this threat and would all be guided by, next please, a huge array of radar networks that the Japanese had that the American scientific team discovered. As a matter of fact, one of the things the American scientific team discovered was Japanese working lasers. This is a magnetron. It turned out the Japanese had developed a death ray over the past 5 years during the war that could kill people at a distance of several miles. Worse than that, what it did was it automatically stopped any motor vehicle. Just stopped the vehicle dead by just destroying its engine, its capability of running on internal combustion. And I'm not an engineer, I'm not trained in engineering, but that was confirmed with all the scientific documents that I dealt with. I could bring up the exact references, exactly what locker boxes, what files that they're in, where such copies are still extant. I'm not going to read out a series of numbers to you now because that's going to be meaningless, but it will ultimately be put on a website, and it does exist. Oh, next one, please. Now, unfortunately, this is a misplaced photo. What it was supposed to show was an American carrier that was loaded with Japanese planes, bringing them back to the United States. But this is when Americans actually began to appreciate Japanese technology and bring it back to the U.S. to reverse engineer it. This is a Japanese Zero that has been repainted with American colorings. This is a Japanese Betty bomber repainted with American colorings. These are just the conventional weapons. So, of course, they were drooling over the really sophisticated weapons. But you're left with a conundrum. Hirohito's choice was he could actually deliver these weapons and create massive destruction in the United States, in which case Japan would be a third world nation again. Here was his conundrum. He's funding at this point his private war. At this point, he's one of the richest men on earth because all of his life, everybody in Japan, per law, like a church, gave 10% to Hirohito, whether they were running a corner store, whether they were running a corporation. So at that point, he had 10% of everyone's income in Japan. During the war, when they had conquered so much of Asia, he took everything he could and added that to his coffers. By 1945, Hirohito had, in World War II dollars, he had $100 billion in Swiss bank accounts, in World War II dollars. So now he's funding a private war from 1945 on. But the point is, if he wipes out the Americans, if he delivers all the biocidals, if he delivers all of the long-range weapons he's got, then the world economy collapses because the world economy is hooked onto the American dollar. So if he collapses the world economy, all of his money in the Swiss bank accounts is worthless. And Japan is back to being a starving third world nation all over again, which is the reason why I went to war in the first place. So he enters into this very long negotiation period, which anticipated what happened with Panmunjom in Korea, which is still ongoing today, which anticipated what happened with the Paris peace talks in Vietnam, still ongoing. So,
Black Lanterns?
Yeah, Black Lanterns should be fine. But at any rate, it all connects back to Roswell because of the deployment of the weapons. Yeah, if you could enlarge in that. Hirohito is one of the most remarkable men that you've never heard of because all of the Japanese actually believed he was a living god. They all worshipped him as such. When he was young, his teacher who taught him military tactics was General Nogi. General Nogi was the general who had won the Russo-Japanese War. He was the man who had defeated the Russians. And General Nogi was scared to death of Hirohito. He had never seen anyone who was so divorced from human emotion in his entire life. He actually advocated that Hirohito be bypassed for secession and the secession for the emperorship be given to another sibling. And as a matter of fact, when Emperor Hirohito was made emperor, that was one of the reasons he killed himself, was because Emperor Hirohito had stated at one point, General Nogi is a brave man for the old kind of war, but he's a coward for the new kind of war. So if you could switch that forward. This is what Hirohito was confronted with in China. This is impassable terrain in China. All of this is unbelievable. All of the Chinese live here. Unless you can teach a human being to live off sand and gravel and dirt and rock and snow, none of this is useful. So at that point in history, in World War II, 1 out of every 4 people on Earth was Chinese. That means 1/4 of the world's population lived in 25% of their own nation. And that's what the Japanese were grabbing. They were up against a nation that was over 10 times their size. The Japanese had less than 100 million people. The Chinese had 1 billion. The only way the Japanese could defeat them was by holocaustic weapons. Next one, please. Another thing they were confronted with was terrain. That's what forced them to develop the dirigibles. We're faced here with rice paddies, terraces. These are mountains. What would normally be hills that would be similar to almost as high as the Cascade Mountains in the United States. All of them are terraced, every inch, to cultivate every inch of land. These are fish ponds where the Chinese were going fish to eat. They would walk across these little stretches of land between these fish ponds that they would raise. There's no way a mechanized army could cross that. These are rivers, and to give you an idea of how dangerous a river is, when Napoleon invaded Russia, the first Russian river he ran into, he lost 20,000 men to the river, not to the Russians. So the Japanese, there's no way they could get a modern mechanized army across any of this except in the sky. So the next one, please. This is one reason why the Japanese built such small tanks. The Western world call them tankettes. These are horrible pictures, but you can see there's a Japanese officer riding on top of a tankette. The tankette is almost like a motorized wheelchair. They'd get stuck in the mud. They'd get caught in ditches. It's very hard to get them charged like that because there's very few open levels of land like that in China. This is a Caucasian soldier looking inside of a Japanese tankette. He has no hope of ever fitting in there. If someone ever stuffed him in there, he could never get out. To give you an example of this, this is why American and Australian and Western prisoners of war died at 7 times the rate in Japanese prison camps than they did in Nazi prison camps, was because by the Geneva Convention, the Japanese were obligated to give prisoners of war half of what their soldiers ate in the field. Well, since anything the Japanese eat in the field is nothing more than bait or mulch or leavings to an average American, an average American being given half of what a Japanese man eats, he'll starve to death within days. And that's what happened to most Americans, most Australians, most Westerners. They couldn't eat the Japanese food, and they just died. Next. This is what they were faced with in terms of cities. These are Chinese walled cities that were built during the Warring States period. They're almost impregnable. The average Chinese person, if you take a look at these walkways, there's no way you can get traffic through here. Many of them would have a central square, and the Japanese would drop from the dirigibles a tank into the central square, which then the men would use to hide behind when they're advancing. But the point is, how do you get in there except by air? To give you an example of what I'm talking about, though, about why this made it ideal for the use of biological warfare, because people might ask, well, with 1 billion people, why wouldn't the biological warfare spread and kill everybody? Because one of the things they were confronted with was the Chinese person of those days, well into World War II, would live and die. He'd be born, live, and die, all within 10 miles. He would never leave 10 miles of where he was born. He or she would just grow up in these walled cities on a farm. There's no roads for them to travel anywhere else. So there's no danger of the disease spreading. That's what made it an ideal testing ground for the disease weapons that Hirohito was developing. It needs to be emphasized that Emperor Hirohito was a marine biologist, but he had an interest in the air. This is him visiting Britain in 1920. And in 1920, he was impressed by the fact that there were only 2 nations in the world that didn't have an air force. All of the major powers, Britain, even minor powers, Romania, Hungary, all of these powers, Italy, Germany, they all had air forces. 2 powers in the world didn't have air forces, the United States and Japan. What the United States had was a U.S. Army Air Corps, and it had U.S. Naval Aviation, but there was no Air Force. The Japanese had naval aviation, and they had an Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, but there was no separate Air Force. Hirohito was convinced by Admiral Onishi, the father of the Kamikaze Corps, he was convinced by him to develop a covert Air Force. That's where the symbol of the black sun comes in. If you ever see Japanese weapons, you can move it forward. They all have the rising sun symbol on them, but Emperor Hirohito's special covert weapons all had a rising sun surrounded by a black circle to symbolize that they were covert. They learned from the Americans. The Americans developed, after World War I, flying aircraft carriers. The Americans said, we can use a blimp, and we can carry these across the Atlantic, and we can turn these fighters loose. Also, these blimps could bomb ships, and the fighters will protect them. So the Americans had the Naval Airship Program, in which they were literally, these are all models of those ships, because none of those ships are extant, but they all belonged to the Navy because they were meant to cross the ocean. So this is why the U.S. Navy has bases in the middle of Iowa and Kansas and out in the middle of nowhere. If you ever see a Navy base out in the middle of a landlocked area and you say, why is this Navy base here? That's where it comes from. The Naval Airship Program meant that the Navy could launch these ships from the protection of the center of the United States and strike across the oceans with impunity. But all of that got stopped by Japanese espionage because all of these ships were sabotaged. There were 3 major ones, the Macon, the Akron, and the Shenandoah. They were obviously prototypes for what would have developed into a very aggressive naval airship program, and all of them went down in flames, Hindenburg style. And the U.S. Navy concluded it had to be Japanese sabotage. And the reason it was so easy for the Japanese to do that was because the Navy was saturated with Filipino stewards that they would import from the Philippines to serve the officers. So it turned out the Filipino stewards were basically infiltrated by a lot of Japanese spies. And so a lot of these airships, when they encountered a storm, suddenly the rudders would fall off and they'd go down Hindenburg style. Next, please. And that destroyed the American Naval Airship Program. That left the Japanese in total dominance. So the Japanese had to figure, this is the Japanese version of the German 88, called an M88. They said, how do we make use of these cannon, these machine guns? This one machine gun here, the M99 machine gun, was responsible for killing more Western soldiers than any Japanese weapon during the war. And so they said, how do we get these in the air? How do we get this in the air? Next, please. So they developed a prototype. This is the prototype. The prototype is a giant airbag surrounding the miniature hydrogen gas cells. Here is the containment box. Containment box could contain anything you want. The rocket racks, inverted Stalin's organs, essentially. They could contain the parasite fighters. They could contain the 88s, inverted upside down so they could fire down. But they all had bomb bays. So they were all meant to hover over Chinese cities and eventually American ones, dropping biocidal weapons that could wipe the population out. Again, the redundancy. Central balloons surrounded by 8 smaller balloons. Japanese could crawl around inside and just patch them up as each one of them got shot. That's why at the Battle of Los Angeles, they were able to hover for hours and take 14,500 rounds and just keep patching the balloons up and then float home. So next, please. This is a combat version of it. Oh, God, I wish I could show better. But you can barely see the M88s hanging inverted. These would hover over Chinese cities and just pound them to rubble. These would hover over advancing Chinese armies and just pound them. So that was what we're talking about. Because of each individual balloon being 100 feet in diameter on the minor outskirts, again, well over 1,000 feet in diameter that we're talking about. The Americans never saw any of this when it was all in China. So even though American intelligence was trying very hard to penetrate that whole system, they were confronted with enormous difficulties. Next, please. This is Emperor Hirohito himself in a way that he's rarely seen. As a matter of fact, you will never see Emperor Hirohito in his lab smock because all of those images were destroyed. I personally destroyed hundreds of them. Any redundant photos were destroyed of him. This was the kind of work that his Unit 731 was doing, and all of this at this point in history is irrefutable. There are numerous books on Unit 731. What they don't tell you about is the threat it posed to the United States. This is an American prisoner of war. The Japanese would use American prisoners of war and they would take photos of it. All of these drawings, I was trained in commercial illustration in vocational school. I drew these drawings and had a commercial illustrator finish them up. But these drawings that I made were graphic notes based on photographs I destroyed. The reason the Japanese would take these cinematic level photographs of the prisoners that they were killing using these weapons was to prove to the Americans that the diseases they were developing worked on white people. Because that was something the Americans didn't believe. The Americans actually believed, oh, well, they're killing all of these millions of Chinese. What does that mean for us? So they had to prove to the Americans, we can kill you too. And that was the whole reason behind that. Okay, next, please. This is the most important man in the war you never heard of. General Shiro Ishii worked at the Pingfang complex in China developing these biocidal shells. These shells were made of porcelain. They were parachute retardant. That way the friction of dropping the bomb would not kill all of the microbes inside. That way they would float down very slowly. They found that early in the morning was the best time to deliver it when the air was cool, when the air had been cooled throughout the night. They could disperse it over a large system. In 1942, just before the Battle of Los Angeles, the Japanese wiped out the entire 4th and 5th Chinese armies using these bombs. And as a matter of fact, Japanese soldiers would win constantly against armies that were 10 times their size because half the Chinese soldiers would be deathly sick. So, next. This is photos that you will never see. These photos I was able to get out and smuggle out. This is an actual deployment of these weapons in China. This man, it's very hard to see from here, but these biocidals were so aggressive that they tore through anything organic. They literally ate it. His clothes are disintegrating off of his body while he's collapsing. This is what would be left, the calcium, all in a very short period of time. We're talking about an organic agent that's devouring through any organic fibers. This is what Hirohito threatened to deploy over the United States. As a matter of fact, he sent those dirigibles to the United States, to Area 51, for the U.S. scientists to look at, that were so loaded with biocidals that the American biologists at Fort Detrick in Maryland concluded that if they were evenly spread over the Earth, they would kill everyone on Earth from just one dirigible. We could try that. That's important. So when we're talking about the Battle of the Fall of Manhattan, what I'm talking about is the penetration of the Manhattan Project. This, by the way, is a flag that you'll never see. This is the United Nations battle flag. This was organized, the United Nations was established where I worked in 1942, January 1st, 1942. The United Nations was established by Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt based that flag on his concept of the 4 freedoms. And the United Nations was meant to organize and orchestrate all resistance armies in Axis-occupied nations. So that meant at the Presidio military base, Japanese-occupied Philippines, German-occupied Denmark, all had their governments at the Presidio military base where they were orchestrating the war effort of their resistance armies under that flag. That's why the flag was so simple, so that resistance soldiers could flash that to each other as a simple symbol which they could all understand. This was used, as you know, till 1948 as a battle flag because the United Nations was still legally at war with Japan until 1951. except in 1948 was pretty much when things had calmed down to the point where they got rid of the battle flag. Okay. This is about 6 Japanese guys in a fiberglass bathtub tried to prove that the Japanese reached the United States first in the 1980s. They went over there with a little rubber dinghy and a sail tied to it, made it all the way to San Francisco, 1,849 miles. This was the Japanese version of the Kon-Tiki expedition, and they did it in the opposite way from the Kon-Tiki, which went the other direction. So they did all this in the 1980s, and to think that the Japanese can go there in a little rubber dinghy like that, and that they couldn't make it across in submarines is absurd. This Japanese pilot is famous in Japan because he spent all of World War II flying over the United States. And he was scouting and doing reconnaissance. They would take off in submarine-launched planes that would go over the United States. Then they would land in the water. That's what they're seaplanes. And then the Japanese submarines would just pick them up and bring them back onto the sub again. Next. This is what the larger submarines were like. They had hangars inside where they would collapse the wings of the aircraft, bring them into the hangar, launch them from the catapult bay. This is one of the smaller ones that carried 2 aircraft. They had a crane here that folded into the bow, and that would dismantle whenever they were ready to retrieve a plane. Next one, please. This is the Sentoku submarine, 400 feet long, carried 3 of these planes that they could assemble in 45 minutes. And in terms of what it carried, it had a German snorkel that was radar absorbent, sonar absorbent. It could stay at sea. It was the largest submarine ever built in the history of mankind until the advent of the nuclear submarine. So the Japanese were using this to threaten the United States with until 1951. And they were threatening it with nuclear assault. Next. The Americans even had paintings for identification for PBY scouts so that they would know what they were running up against. You could load the submarine up with anything, including suicide rockets. This all goes back to what happened at Roswell. This is a balloon train, almost as tall as the Eiffel Tower. That's how the Japanese were able to monitor that the Americans had tested an atomic bomb at Trinity. That's why the Americans gave the Mogul Project, which they later on said was what happened at Roswell. They gave the Mogul Project the same top secret clearance that they gave the Manhattan Project, because they were trying to figure out how did the Japanese know we had wasted a bomb at Trinity. And so the reason that's important is because you could load those balloon trains inside of a submarine like this and launch it. And the Americans thought that would work to use that as an excuse because they were trying to explain why Jesse Marceau Sr. was able to fit a basically the military equivalent of a 747 military transport plane with so much balloon material. So they were using the Mogul as an excuse. These were balloon bombings that took place all over the United States. These were duds, the ones that failed. This is a Japanese map of World War II. And they were starting firestorms so they could monitor the smoke and figure out how to use the winds to direct their larger dirigibles. These are Japanese prisoner of war camps. These Japanese prisoner of war camps where the Americans took Japanese prisoners of war did not open until 1945. So every single one of these Japanese soldiers brought here was here after Americans thought the war was over. And they would be there for years. These were the typical balloon bombs. They're huge, not nearly as large as the dirigibles. That's Robert Goddard. Robert Goddard, of course, worked at Roswell, New Mexico. Robert Goddard developed rockets. He was the American version of Wernher von Braun. The Americans wouldn't listen to him. They wouldn't invest in his weapons. Finally, during World War II, when the Americans are confronted with 9,000 balloons within a 6-month period that are setting forest fires and starting firestorms all over the Pacific Northwest, they came back to Robert Goddard and they said, "Can you develop rockets which can take these balloons down?" And he said, "Are you insane? The Japanese are building these balloons out of rice paper and silk. My rockets are made of metal. We're going to be exposing what's the equivalent in World War II of thousands and thousands of dollars to take down something that cost the Japanese a couple $100s to build." He says, "There's no way we can do that." And they said, "What can we do?" He said, "Build American kamikazes." He said, "Something worse is coming." He said, "Something worse is coming." And after the Nagasaki bomb was dropped, this is important to remember, when the Hiroshima bomb was dropped and the war went nuclear, that's when Emperor Hirohito launched the super dirigibles. By the time they reached the United States, the Americans had dropped the Nagasaki bomb. And when the dirigibles got there, they called Dr. Goddard, who at that time was in Baltimore, Maryland. They said, "Dr. Goddard, there's these 1,000-foot balloons hovering overhead that are loaded with biocidals." And he died. He died of a heart attack at that moment. That very day, he died because everything he had predicted would happen, happened. And that's something that no one ever talks about, but you can look up his death date. August 10th, same day as the Nagasaki bomb, same day as those dirigibles landed in Area 51. These are the Americans vainly using a fork-tailed devil, as the Japanese call it, P-38 Mustang, I believe, to shoot down these balloons. It was a futile effort. They're trying to send a few planes out to shoot down thousands of these balloons. To show you the strategic impact of these balloons, this is Hanford, south central Washington State. This site produced most of America's plutonium. And that's where all of the plutonium came to build the atomic bomb the Americans were building, the Fat Man, sourced from that site. And the reason why was because it had a hydroelectric dam. And the hydroelectric dam was capable of providing the energy they needed. Now, what happened was this was kept top secret until the 1990s, when it was found to be one of the most radioactive places on Earth. And at that time, they had to shut it down because no one could even enter without dying. But at some time during World War II, the exact date escapes me at the moment, but I can look it up. But it was the day the Americans did the massive Tokyo firebombing. So the day the Americans sent a massive bomber raid over Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito sent a single rubber and silk balloon, and it hit all of the power lines at Hanford Dam and shut it down completely for 3 days. The Manhattan Project was stopped. The atomic bomb project was stopped for 3 entire days until they could fix those power lines. And that's when they realized Emperor Hirohito not only knows we have the bomb, he knows exactly where we're making all of the constituent assembly parts for the bomb. And they kept trying to figure out how could the Japanese know all this. When that silk bomb came in, it came in through a massive rain front. That's how well they knew the winds. They knew the winds so well by 1945 they could send it through a massive rainstorm to actually take those power lines out. Next, please. This is emphasizing that the Northwest would have burned down had the firebombing continued, but the Japanese weren't interested in burning down miles of uninhabited forest. They were interested in finding out the winds so they could actually send weapons of mass destruction over. This poor dope belonged to what's called the 555, the Triple Nickels. These were African Americans who belonged to the Conservation Corps. They were sent in as smoke jumpers to fight these fires. And because they were fighting these fires, hundreds of them died. One of the reasons why hundreds of them died was because the Americans were conserving all the materials they could get. So they were conserving silk themselves because most silk came from Asia. A lot of rubber came from Asia. The Americans had to conserve it, so they gave them these small parachutes. They called them black parachutes because only the blacks were allowed to use them. This man is hanging limp because he's just died. The shock of that parachute opening that's so small cracked every bone in his body. Hundreds of these men would die like that, just falling into the middle of firestorms and them burning. Next. These were the conscientious objectors. The conscientious objectors in World War II had a choice: go to jail or fight these forest fires. These were all whites. So there's about 600 of them. They were fighting the fires from the outside. And by the end of the war, they built a museum for them. If you want to understand how all of this was hidden, again, a terrible map. This one shows it a bit better. All of this is federal land, except for this tiny thin strip right here. All of this is federally owned parkland, federally owned reservations, missile testing sites, Indian reservations. So when you couple all this together in these 17 states with all of the land that the U.S. military and U.S. government owns, it turns out that well over half of the United States is totally federally owned and isolated. And there's no way you're going to see what's happening on it unless you're poaching or prospecting. When I was trying to get a job with a civilian think tank, the RAND Corporation, they asked me to work on a project as what I thought the next American Civil War would look like. I said the division is going to be east and west as opposed to north and south, because out here you've got nothing but mountains, missile silos, Mormons, and militiamen. And everywhere else you've got the cities. So when I worked on that map, it directly corresponded to all of that federally owned land that a lot of more independently minded people want to get back. This is the American kamikaze that the Americans finally designed on Goddard's suggestion. This was meant to crash into that big thing that Goddard kept expecting, the massive superdirigibles. This was actually the XP-79. They built a few of them, and in the sense of killing their pilot, they succeeded. Some of America's test pilots died developing this. It has no real machine guns on it. It's simply meant to crash. And so that's something you'll never hear about, is the American kamikaze program. That's how desperate they were. They would not have contracted that otherwise. These are Americans years later to show you how they're affected. These are guys who are going balloon hunting. This tree is charred. You can even see that here. They find thermite pellets. This is very dangerous work. No one is recommended to do this. We're just about finished, so we'll take that break in a second. But this man's tribulations, Archie Mitchell, they pretty much speak to the balloon bombing program, because he's a reverend who took a bunch of children on a field trip, and a big Japanese silk balloon bomb landed during the war. And they all went and played with it because it was covered with all the Japanese flower symbols and chrysanthemums, and it blew, and all of them died. So what happened was the US Congress approved a bill that President Truman signed on June 7, 1949, providing money to the Mitchell tragedy, $5,000 to him, you know, $3,000 for each child of the bereaved parents. The Department of the Army actually argued we should get the Japanese to pay for this. And the Senate, however, said no, the US Army is responsible because they didn't tell anybody. And that was the solution the Americans had, was when all of these firestorms were going on, when America was threatened with all of this massive destruction, the Army and Navy solution, and at that time it was basically the Army and Navy said, just don't tell anyone. So that'll be it for now. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. What we have here with this photograph, these may look like rivers or some kind of like root system from a plant. This is actually taken from one of those Japanese dirigibles. This is one of those photographs I was able to photocopy. Picture taken of the ground in China, overland. What you see here is static electricity. As I was saying before, it was so powerful going along the hull of a ship, an airship, that it would actually create static electricity discharge that registered on the photographs. So most of the photographs the blimps would take would be crisscrossed by electricity. And so with that kind of power, the Americans a long time ago, this is an American blimp plan, they had an idea for harnessing that static electricity for discharge in a static electricity cannon, a cannon that would literally shoot lightning. So again, the Japanese took this idea from the Americans and they created their own. The American airship program went down in flames due to the sabotage I spoke of. This is the battle dirigible Mikado. Mikado means emperor in Japanese in the traditional ancient language. This was the emperor's flagship of the sky. This has the 16-petaled chrysanthemum, the gold symbol of the emperor. It looks somewhat like an accordion, comes out terribly on this photograph, has a few rudders in the back. Mostly it's a flying skyscraper. We didn't have time to insert any Japanese planes nearby to give it scale, but you're talking about something that is very high. Probably, like I said, we had over 1,000 feet in diameter for the dish-shaped blimps. This is about 1,000 feet high, at least. And it's folded like a Chinese or Japanese lantern, so they could actually collapse it and hide it in a bunker and hide it in a cave system. So when it inflated like that, filled with a hydrogen gas, then you've got so much surface that the static electricity discharge was enormous. This is the plasma cannon they developed, the center line that runs all the way along the base that Emperor Hirohito was able to discharge literally bolts of lightning. The performance, however, was erratic at best. So he couldn't get the air to behave the way he always wanted it. So it had a very poor performance. That brings us to the Battle of Los Angeles eventually. Please. And so this was the Emperor's control room. It's very difficult to see these. What you have here is a hex grid system, because what I was doing was tracing blueprints. And what I was able to do was take some gaming materials that they used to war game with. I was trying to apply for jobs at think tanks. Now, all of the think tanks would war game nuclear war or various other conflicts on hex grid patterns because the pieces could move in 6 different directions. That's why a hex grid. I took this hex grid paper and I actually traced a lot of these forwards and Ares and other blueprints while I was working. The Emperor's room is above the control room of the plasma cannon, and there's literally a 2-person bed there, because as the Emperor, they were not going to allow him to sleep in a bunk. So for him, this was almost like a pleasure cruise. And it had to be lightweight balsa wood, lightweight bamboo, because they couldn't have anything heavy. They couldn't have a metal frame. So he was sleeping on a very strong, very light bamboo bed. This was the Emperor. What's very strange about this, aside from the fact that he looks like Heinrich Himmler, is that he looks so much older than he appeared during the war. And it's a very strange painting that's done of it. It shows the goddess of the sun handing him the sword, which is how he had this portrait hanging in the battle dirigible Mikado. And that was a favorite portrait he had of himself because it showed himself as an old man in uniform. Even though he was a young man at that time, he swore that he was going to outlive every leader of World War II and that he was going to die basically in charge of his own destiny. Next, please. Now, this is the parasite fighters that were used on a lot of these dirigibles. This man was named Zimmerman. Zimmerman created a pancake-shaped craft that would have the pilot flying prone, so it would be totally aerodynamic without all of the bumps and hindrances to aerodynamic flow that so many other aircraft of World War II had. So when he presented this to the U.S. Army and the Navy, they both said, well, our pilots can't stand flying on their stomachs. One of the reasons why was size, one of the reasons why was weight, but since none of the armies or navies would buy it in the United States, he sold it to Japan. And when he sold it to Japan, their pilots could fly it easily because their pilots were so small and so short and compact. So it was perfect for them, and it was a perfect parasite fighter. You could carry half a dozen of these at least on one of those dirigibles. Okay, next please. So this was the German version of it, what they call the flying triangle. This is, if you can see this here, a prone pilot through the cockpit while it was being built and constructed. So Zimmerman was trying to display this to the United States. Again, like Robert Goddard, genius was ignored. And they went instead for mass production and just brute force. Next. These were the Japanese prototypes that they built of what were called the Zimmers, or the Zimmerman skimmers. And as you can see, the sun is surrounded by a black disk, meaning it's a covert project. They're flying over Mori Torishima. Mori Torishima is popularized in Japanese Godzilla films as Monster Island. And the reason that it was done so was because that was one of the islands that the Americans were never able to invade. That island is still Japanese occupied today. To this day, it's still Japanese occupied. These were the pilots. They're wearing aerodynamic flight and pressure suits so that their blood pressure will continue to be level throughout massive changes in aerodynamic pressure. Their heads are shaved, eyebrows shaved, everything except the eyelashes. These are the Yakuza pilots. This is a real poor illustration done of them based on accounts from witnesses during years and years ago from Roswell. It's done by Bill McDonald, who is a forensic illustrator. And he even differentiates Roswell from Gray. So that's an important point to make, is that even he intuitively realizes these are not aliens. And so you can see their humanity. You can see how they look. You can see, even with 4 fingers, however, how anyone who encounters these poor individuals when they were crashed on the ground all over New Mexico, wearing asbestos suits, their faces burned, you can imagine how that would shock people. As a matter of fact, one of the people who was assigned to guard them was, I'm trying to think of his name, Sergeant Melvin Brown. He was on guard at one of the impact sites. He's the one who lifted the tarp and looked at the bodies. He said they were yellow. Did not say they were gray. They were yellow. They were burned orange with all of the burning scars that they had. They turned gray later as rigor mortis set in. Those are the bodies at Area 51. They've got these prisoners of war in glass pickle jars, and they try to tell people with movies like Independence Day, well, they're really aliens. That way nobody's involved in war crimes. But this is how the parasite fighters were able to hook back into, these are the combat version of the parasite fighters. They have guns, they're mounted, they have a javelin up in front. Each one of them could carry a single biocide bomb that they could drop over a distant area. This increased the range of the dirigibles and what they could bomb with biocidal weapons tenfold by sending out these parasite fighters to act as bombers. But this javelin in front would be there throughout its entire period of flight. It did not hinder its flight capability. It had a folding hook up here that it would unfold so it could get caught on the lines and retrieved. You can see the guns over here. So this is truly a flying dreadnought. It's carrying cannons, carrying parasite fighters. Next, please. They were retrieved with this ingenious mechanism taken from the American original idea. Javelin's always in place out here, folds up here, gets retrieved by the lines, gets brought up into the silk holes around here. This whole thing is open circle so that they could bring the parasite fighters in to park them onto the hangar bay. At that point, the pilot would actually be standing up. They'd bring them in, and these would all be lined up in a row like Peking ducks, like you see hanging in a Chinese restaurant, so that they could carry many of them efficiently. Next. This is a gunner's mate's view of exactly what it looks like from the air, looking down from the cannon. The Hindenburg is important here because it's what I described that happened at Roswell. The suction carried by the Inferno when they vented all the gas cells and just self-immolated was very similar to what happened with the Hindenburg. That's why you had so many survivors. A lot of people reported survivors at these crash sites. What they thought were aliens, these burned people who were either in pain or unharmed, being loaded onto trucks, captured and whatnot. American soldiers beating them. Many witnesses saw that. And the reason you had so many survivors is similar to what happened in the Hindenburg. More people survived the Hindenburg crash than died. And those were the people who listened to the German captain, because the German airship captain said, stay on the dirigible and you will not die, because it will float down, even if it's burning. Everything's burning above us, but we'll hit the ground soft. Everybody who listened to him survived. Everyone who died was a jumper. But this illustration shows something that didn't really happen. shows the person sucked up into that section. Nobody would have done that on a civilian ship simply because they're in the gondola. They would have to have like literally tried to jump out and suddenly get sucked up and wound up in there. I think that's an indulgence, but that definitely did happen with the Japanese dirigibles, because with the Japanese dirigibles, you have people actually within the airbag surrounded by the hydrogen bags who are sucked up into the gas cell, the airborne firestorm. This is Dysversky. Dysversky was like a military version of Zbigniew Brzezinski. He basically thought up a plan of attack for the Americans before World War II. He was a former Russian Tsarist officer. The reason he's important is because he was telling the Americans, this is what led to the Air Force clampdown on Roswell. He was telling the Americans, or rather the U.S. Army Air Corps clamped down on Roswell. There wasn't an Air Force yet at that time, and the U.S. Army wanted an Air Force bad. So he was saying to the Americans, look, my nation, the Tsarist Russians, they had an Air Force, by the way. The Tsars had an Air Force. He said, we were defeated by the Japanese. They can defeat you too. And he said, you've got to listen to me. All of these passive air defense systems are not going to work. You have to have an attack system. Everything needs to be offensive so you can kill them first. Next, please. So, of course, it didn't help that he had sold the planes he had designed to the Japanese as well. So the Dysversky planes that he had created later wound up confronting the Americans wearing Japanese symbols. They were codenamed Dicks. Next. But what he did point out, long before Midway, was that the surface carriers are useless. He says they do the exact opposite of what you need with air power. You get all of your air assets in one concentrated area. When that goes, all your air assets go. This is the Ark Royal. The British Ark Royal was sunk by a little German U-boat. And when that went down, a huge amount of trained airmen, sailors, everything went down with it. He said, we need an Air Force. He said, you need an Air Force controlled right in the center of the United States so no one can sink it, and you can send all of your bombers out to attack. Sorry about that. But what's interesting about that is that you see on this map that he drew is that there's nothing towards the Atlantic, and it's all projected towards Japan. And since this book was published before World War II, the Japanese took that as a direct threat and a warning. Next, please. He also proved, this is the kind of nerve center he was talking about. You've seen it in war movies. He proved that all the bombers that get through don't get through on speed. Later on in the 50s, because the V-2 rocket technology was still new, still slow, they used to build those delta wing bombers and fighters. And the reason they built them delta wing was because at that point, the planes were faster than the rockets. So they thought, we can outfly the rockets just by building a fast enough plane. But in his day, that wasn't the case. You needed firepower. That's why the bombers were surrounded with ball turret gunners everywhere they went. And so they were able to muscle their way through. So he said, since it's the firepower that carries a bomber through, the Japanese are going to be sending something with a lot of firepower, just like we've seen in the dirigibles. His answer was develop a long-range interceptor. This is very difficult to see here, but it's got propellers on each side that are radio-controlled. He was telling the Americans to invest in this. Again, a case where the Americans just weren't listening. And that's why the Americans had nothing to throw up against the dirigibles. In World War II, they fielded a football team that was all offense and no defense. And so when the Battle of Los Angeles took place, there wasn't a single American plane to send up against the dirigibles back home. Next. This is what the Japanese were using over the Battle of Los Angeles. Not those sophisticated parasite fighters that I was showing you, because that was developed later in the war. They were using the same stuff they used in China. Probably their equivalent, very similar to a biplane. No oxygen tank. The pilots can fly only to a certain altitude. Mostly the dirigibles had to go low so that they wouldn't kill the pilots from lack of oxygen. That's why the Battle of Los Angeles, everybody was able to see them hovering overhead with so many witnesses. And after the Battle of Los Angeles, when the Emperor lost several of these planes, he knew that the Americans would be able to reverse engineer them and know their weaknesses. So all of these planes, that entire class of planes, was retired to training duty. And that's when he brought in the flying pancake-shaped Zimmers. The Battle of Los Angeles itself, all these beams hit in this area. They're trying to focus on the planes that are being dispatched from the dirigibles, because most of the gunners can't see at that high an altitude to know that the dirigibles are even there. But most of the public that's not blinded by all the searchlights saw the dirigibles. That night was a gibbous moon. That meant that 65% of the moon was hanging in the sky. So all of the shapes of the dirigibles were showing up brightly. and that's what the emperor wanted. This was right after he had conducted a raid on Port Darwin. He had basically destroyed, that was Australia's Pearl Harbor. He had destroyed the entire Australian Navy in port at Port Darwin, so then he attacked Los Angeles. LA area raided, was headlines. They even told where Japanese planes were shot down. Next. Yeah. So later on, what the US government did was they actually, these days we call it Photoshop, but Photoshop's a program. Back in those days, it was more airbrush and what they would call document alteration. They actually stuck in, you can barely see it here, a shape of a UFO in the middle of those search beams. That was later stuck in. That wasn't originally in any of those photos, but they wanted the people to think, well, if they think it's aliens, then they won't blame us for being defenseless. That was literally the logic. This is a very rare photograph. This is an actual manned rocket bomb being dropped from a bomber. This is exactly what the Japanese, if they had used that at the Battle of Los Angeles, would have wiped the entire city of Los Angeles out. They didn't have that at that point in history, but I bring it up because it factors in later. This is what was delivered to Area 51, was the dirigibles loaded with suicide rockets like this. These were basically the first weapons to break the sound barrier, because the sailors would hear them when they would come near a ship. They would disintegrate as they broke the sound barrier and then blow. And the reason that made them perfect weapons, because that was like a proximity fuse. It actually created more damage because as the Japanese pilots broke the sound barrier, the explosion would destroy everything around a ship, including the damage of the sound barrier itself. Later on, the Americans copied this. They said, let's take Chuck Yeager and we'll stick him in an X-1 and we'll make him break the sound barrier, only he doesn't have to kill himself. And so that was how the Americans got that idea. It's really lame, but you know, that's one of the things that was done there. Well, after the Battle of Los Angeles, the Americans fished out, the Navy fished out a flattened, huge rubberized silk balloon, one of the ones that had been ejected from one of the super dirigibles, and they fished it out of the ocean, and this is what they reconstructed. They thought it was something like this. This is actually not aerodynamically sound. There's no way anything like this could fly, but that's what the Americans thought they were facing by what they were able to retrieve. The one thing they did get right was the ring of machine gun nests that the Japanese had, because somehow they were able to figure out that they had to have machine guns surrounding the dirigible to protect them from any air interception. So they were able to figure that quite correctly, but the rest of it was kind of like a myth that led to the flying saucer myth. The Americans thought they were literally facing craft that looked like this. And with the Los Angeles film now, the Battle of Los Angeles, again, they're trying to push the alien theme and tell you, well, it was aliens, and that way no one ever thinks that America was ever attacked on its own home soil. But the aliens look like this. Yeah. Next one, please. Oh, yes, that's it for now. We could try the next one. But in terms of these movies, what I keep having to emphasize to people is that it's like embedded reporting on the battlefield. Every single one of these movies, whether it's Top Gun or let's try Atomic Axis, should be fine. That should probably close it out before Asians as Aliens. And in terms of these films, all of the planes that you see in Top Gun, Independence Day, Battle of Los Angeles, all the helicopters flying information, these are actual soldiers and sailors and airmen that are flying these machines. These are not extras. These are not actors. These are not people that they hire on the spot to fly them. These have to be military. And the only way the military provides that kind of backing to a film is when the filmmaker agrees to do it the military's way. So that's why so many filmmakers are embedded, just like reporters. They report what the military tells them to report because that covers the military. And that keeps them irresponsible in terms of what they failed to do during wars like World War II, where they failed to defend the United States. And so that's why they bring in all of these movies and welcome them and work with them. And that's why in Battle of Los Angeles, you see real Marine Corps helicopters flying information in that film. That's why in Independence Day, you see real Air Force jets flying in that film. It's because it serves their purpose. They wouldn't work with it otherwise. But in terms of this gives us a good example of the distances the Americans were dealing with in the Pacific War. Japan, people think of as a small nation. It actually, at that point in history, included Taiwan, where I was born. It is huge. It is actually longer than the United States. And that's the kind of distance the Americans had to cover. And everything the Americans got, I will re-emphasize this with another picture, everything they got in 4 or 5 years of war, they never retrieved the amount of territory the Japanese took in 24 hours after Pearl Harbor. Everything the Americans took was mostly insignificant islands in the Pacific so they could use them as staging bases for bombing raids that ultimately failed as a campaign. The Japanese retained all of Indonesia where they had the oil. 90% of the Japanese army was in China, the rest in Vietnam. Everybody the Americans ran against in the Pacific was a Japanese sailor, was a Japanese Marine. Very few times did Americans run into Japanese army. And all of that army was here because that's where the emperor wanted them, because that's where he kept the dirigibles. That's where he kept the strategic threat. Next. This is Enrico Fermi. Enrico Fermi, I believe, is right, this one or this one. And he was a science advisor to President Roosevelt. And what happened was when Einstein came up with the E equals mc squared equation, every physicist in the world knew that that could lead to a bomb because it meant an enormous release of energy. But Enrico Fermi, who advised Roosevelt, was so conservative in his scientific approach, he told Roosevelt, it's going to take us 100 years to build a bomb out of this equation. So Roosevelt never invested in the Manhattan Project until the middle of the war when Einstein came, escaping from Germany, and organized a lobby of Jewish scientists and Russian scientists and other international emigres to beg Roosevelt to try and build an atomic bomb. And the America was dead last, thanks to Enrico Fermi. And so when Einstein finally got it going, the Axis had it first. And that's something that the Japanese scientists were over here. Actually, a few of them won the Nobel Prize after the war because of the work they did in nuclear physics. This is actually a Japanese cyclotron. That's in Tokyo. That was there in the 1920s. So in terms of the Americans, they took their Japanese scientists and they stuck them in internment camps and told them, you have to help us design artificial rubber since we can't get any from the Asian mainland anymore. So they were just wasting all this brain power. And next, please. One of the reasons the Japanese were able to develop an atomic bomb was because of Birobidzhan. What happened was Adolf Hitler wanted to get rid of his Jewish population. So before America and Germany went to war, he was able to get the Japanese to accept 1 million Jewish emigres. They were all resettled here, and you can look this up. It's called the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. It still exists today. You will not find it printed on any single American map. It is only on maps if you look it up on the internet. Jewish Autonomous Oblast, still a buffer state between the Soviet Union and Manchuria, or China today. But at that time, because the Japanese accepted these Jewish immigrants, many of them were physicists, engineers, scientists. The Japanese were able to get them to help with building a Japanese atomic bomb at Konan Complex, known as Hungnam in Korean. That's in North Korea. And at that juncture of rivers, 3 rivers, the Yalu, the Chosen, and the Fusang, the Japanese were able to dam those rivers and create so much power that that was the largest industrial complex in all of Asia in World War II. It generated so much electricity that it literally equaled 1/3 of the output of the entire nation of Japan. And with that, more than that, it was next to uranium ore deposits. So the Japanese were able to build atomic bombs, and they exploded one very close to that on August 12th. That was after Nagasaki, because Emperor Hirohito wanted to show the Americans he had a nuclear teeth, that he had bite for his strategic deterrence. Next, please. These are the Germans and the Japanese exchange program of uranium. This is why the Axis was able to develop a standardized uranium bomb, the little boy type shape. These are German, these happen to be Japanese visiting the Third Reich, and these happen to be Germans visiting Japanese-occupied China. But their exchange program was aggressive and enormous. This was the Japanese nuclear bomber program. This is a redundant image. I've showed you this before. But this was the long-range type of plane that they had to deliver nuclear weapons. These were actually built in the 1920s and 30s when they started working on Einstein's equations. This is the Ki-20, and the Ki-20, the Germans, it was so huge that the Germans built 2 of them, the Japanese built 6, which shows you how serious they were about this. That's what kept the Soviet Union from attacking throughout the war, until the late war around 1945 after the Hiroshima bombing. Then the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Until that time, these 6 bombers kept the Soviet Union at bay. This is the closest concept that we have to a lot of the Japanese super bombers, was the American Northrop Flying Wing, similar in shape and weight, carrying capacity. Next. This was the Japanese version of it, again starting with small prototypes and getting larger. So what we're going to talk about now is the American attempt to reverse engineer so many of these Japanese technologies and what finally triggered the Roswell incident. This is Seversky's book, Victory Through Air Power. Again, published before World War II, he said, as far back as 1929, General Billy Mitchell wrote that Alaska is within striking range of any place in the Pacific. So that's why Alaska was so important to the American infrastructure and why the Americans wanted to bomb Japan from Alaska rather than invade all through the Pacific. This is a kind of sketch he made. This is how we can take down the Japanese octopus. Again, this was done before the war. We can take it out just by attacking the heart of the beast. This drawing provoked the Battle of Midway. Everybody talks about the 4 Japanese carriers that were lost. At that point already, Hirohito knew from Seversky's writings and observations the fleet carriers were meant to be sacrificed. He didn't care about losing them. What they don't tell you about is the Japanese may have lost 4 carriers, but they lost about 200 pilots. The Americans lost about 150. So the Americans lost an equal number almost of trained pilots, even though they lost only 1 carrier. So the Battle of Midway was no victory because of the enormous expense in training a pilot. What they never tell you about is this. The top part of the Midway is the most important part. They never show that in the films. The Japanese invasion of Alaska. They bombed Dutch Harbor, they landed Marines in Alaska, and they occupied it for the next 3 years. These are Japanese Marines in Alaska. The Americans amassed a huge fleet to try and get them out of Attu and Kiska. The Americans' planes were shot down constantly by Japanese planes. This is a picture of an American PBY being taken down by Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Finally, the Americans had to invade. There was one Japanese massive banzai charge, which the Americans were so, they had so many casualties that the Americans decided they were going to invade the next island, the Aleutians, by all sides and just box the Japanese in. But at that point, the Japanese were ordered to retreat by the emperor, and the Americans who invaded that island all wound up killing each other in the fog because they could only identify each other as alien soldiers. That was how bad the Alaskan campaign was. Next. So the Americans finally had to build the Trans-American Highway all the way up through Canada to supply an invasion that would retake those islands, and then in the last few months of the war be able to bomb Japan from Alaska. So Midway was this tremendous victory for the Japanese that's portrayed as an American victory. So what did the Americans learn from that? Admiral Burke said, get rid of the carriers and create a seaplane strike force where we won't need carriers anymore. So the powers that be, basically the men who set the fiscal budgets, and it wasn't Truman, and it wasn't Eisenhower. We're talking about congressional committees, Senate site overhearings, people who were supposed to have a hand in deciding what the taxpayer was going to sacrifice. They all said, and this is what's important, it doesn't matter whether you believe there was a Nazi stronghold in Antarctica. The US government was convinced there was a Nazi stronghold in Antarctica. So in the last months of 1946, they ordered Operation High Jump, an American invasion of Antarctica. And they gave the Navy all these old PBYs, the same ones that were used in Alaska, and they said, take the Nazis down. This will be one of the last great battles of World War II. So it was a Navy operation. Because of that, I didn't deal very much with the records. Most of what I dealt with was Army and the Air Force that evolved from the Army. So I don't know much about it, but I do know it was a terrible failure. It cost Admiral Byrd his career, and the Navy came back so damaged that they lost any potential for winning the budget battle, and all of the money went to the Army. Next, please. So what the Navy wanted was, of course, what the Japanese had, planes that would take off from submarines. Next. And that pretty much finishes that, but we'll go on to Asians as aliens. Should be fine, because it's such an important part. But the point that I'm making is when the Army was given the budget, then the Army said, well, now we have the ability to set up a state within a state. Because then they set up this Air Force, and the Air Force was this tremendous budget black hole, and has been so ever since. The entire, as a matter of fact, on the same day as Roswell, when Roswell took place, the, let me check out what his name was. One of the colonels, Blanchard, it was Blanchard over at Roswell Army Airfield. It was not an Air Force base at that time, it was Roswell Army Airfield. He was actually meeting with the governor of New Mexico to get officially declared a National Air Force Day, so that the governor would lobby for a National Air Force Day, so that America would have a holiday dedicated to nothing but this Air Force in honor of this new concept that the Army had, where they could take all these physicists, all these scientists and soldiers who were no longer fit for Army service, and put them in the Air Force service as a real budget. It was basically a pork barrel, and has been so ever since. The Air Force has really done nothing to strategically protect the United States. But why were Asians perceived as aliens when so many Americans saw them? Posters like this were shown in all American schools at the time of World War II. And I don't say this to just go over unpleasant racist attitudes at that time. Things like this, these are documents very difficult to see here. But I have copies of these documents where Japanese women and children who were killed on those islands, people forget that the Pacific Islands were loaded with Japanese colonists. None of them were allowed to surrender. Many Japanese women and children were killed. The Americans would send the bones back to American laboratories so the Americans could study them because the Americans literally thought they were a subhuman species. So when all of the children were growing up, these wound up at UC Berkeley. These bones are at UC Berkeley, and these are actually category cards that UC Berkeley uses to classify them with lower primates. Next. And in terms of, this is where Berkeley stores those bones. UC Berkeley actually keeps those bones in this hallway of Japanese women and children that they were considered a subhuman species. This is their thank you letter. This is actually a thank you letter they sent to American officers who sent them boxes full of these bones. And they specified, thank you, we want only the women and children. We don't need the men because we have so many of them. This shows a Japanese skin being tanned as a hide. This is not a real photograph, obviously, but this attitude was all through the United States. When you have that level of hatred, you can no longer really consider the people that you're dealing with as human. Next, please. This is a Japanese woman, this is an American woman who was sent a Japanese skull as a paperweight. You can't see it here, but it was autographed by everybody in the unit that sent it to her. And she worked in Arizona and in the Four Corners region, and there were thousands of human ears that were pickled, skulls, skins, finger bones that were sent back to the United States that the Americans kept. This is actually a Japanese head that was mounted on a truck as a hood ornament. And these pictures were shown in Life magazine. Life magazine actually published these pictures for the American public to consume. Anybody who has that level of callousness, the one thing we can say about the Nazis was they ran their Konzentrationslager, or concentration camps, covertly. Many concentration camps were actually outside of Germany. They had to create an entire second army, the SS, to carry out the Holocaust, as opposed to the regular army. The Americans, with regular troops and regular citizens, put everybody who was of Asian descent, who was suspected of being Japanese, in internment camps, had displays like this openly. It was all agreed to by the American public. Those people were revoked of their U.S. citizenship. When you get to that point, then at that point, nobody you're looking at is human when you see them. When you see an actual ethnic person of that other race, you think of them as alien. To give you an example of this, Otabenga was a pygmy, and this photograph is in a textbook that was about anthropology. Otabenga, this poor pygmy, was stuck in the New York Zoo as a primate. And so the Americans considered him a lower primate. And my grandfather actually went to see him at the zoo, and they used to throw him peanuts. And this was a portrait of a Japanese man as a monkey. The reason this is important, there's thousands and thousands of racist cartoons like this. What makes it special? What makes it special is that was published in 1945, long after the surrender. So the propagation of hatred was still ongoing. This is Asian Sambo. This is just all of the typical Asian stereotypes taken to their extreme. The almond eyes, the pug nose, everything is just taken to its extreme with that. This is Buck Rogers in 1947. These comics were issued at the same time the Roswell accident took place. They actually are dated. It's very difficult to read them, but they're dated 1947. So the Buck Rogers comics show the granddaddy of all alien grays. And he's going around on a different planet. Buck Rogers is fighting him. For some reason, his daughter happens to be a sexy Latina. And Buck Rogers is over here killing all these Asian-looking aliens. He's calling them gooks. That's the funny thing. It's 1947. He's referring to all these Asians as gooks. Why? Because the war is still pretty much legally on until 1951. This is the... This was in the 1980s. You can't see it very well here, a red Japanese sun symbol, the sun disk. You've got, again, the no-nose, the buck teeth, the Asian ornaments. These are Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, all being threatened by this alien menace. This is the 1980s, and they're showing United Nations flag in place of the Iwo Jima flag. And the reason this is so important is if this level of dehumanization is still going on in the 1980s, how do you expect people in 1947 to interpret what they see in front of them as a human being when they see a 4-foot burned individual with no hair. And that's what's so important with that. I think that's pretty much it. And we might have another section with some other photos. There should be. Yes, this is basically the punchline. We'll cover this in 10 minutes because it's so important, because a lot of people are not going to understand what does he mean by the war still legally going on. If you could enlarge in that. By the end of the war, as soon as the Hiroshima bomb was dropped, the Americans were confronted with the fact that for the first time in the Pacific War, they're going to have this many Americans facing this many Japanese. Until this point in the Pacific War, the Americans outnumbered the Japanese in every single battle 3-1. You're fighting on islands that are literally 400 yards across at their choke points, with men killing each other with knives. And suddenly, for the first time in the war, if they're going to hit the Japanese home islands, they're going to be overwhelmed. So Hirohito said, how do I get the Soviets in Asia to counterbalance the Americans? He took all of his heavy tanks out of Manchuria and moved them back to Japan, to Tokyo. The Soviets saw their opening, and that's when they invaded, which was exactly what Hirohito wanted. This says right here, General Prince Hiroshima, and he was one of, I'm mispronouncing that terribly right now because I can't read that well, but at any rate, it says right here, commanded the Imperial Japanese Army following Japan's surrender. This is a photo from the U.S. Army. Credit, U.S. Army credit. What does that mean? After the surrender, he commanded the Imperial Japanese Army, basically because the war with the Soviet Union continued. They tried to invade Hokkaido, and then it continued with the Americans. So what was going on at that point, the Japanese appear on the battleship Missouri. They've got no swords to surrender. Any official surrender ceremony the Japanese partake in, they always surrender their swords. The Americans were selling tickets. You don't sell tickets to a surrender, you sell tickets to a circus. What's more is they had a courier fly all the way from Washington, D.C. with a special flag. If you look up any photo of the battleship Missouri where you see that flag, that courier spent 120 waking hours traveling thousands of miles to bring that flag to hang over that ceremony. That flag is flown backwards. It has 32 stars. Every single one of the stars is upside down. At that point in history, the United States had 48 stars. It did not have 32, excuse me. So they have a backwards flag, 32 stars, all upside down. Why? Because it's not a legal ceremony. Next. That guy was so exhausted when he got there with the flag, he slept for 2 days, and he slept through the 25-minute ceremony. All of these guys you see at the surrender ceremony, they're British, they're Dutch, they're French, they're Soviet, they're American, Australian, New Zealand. There's no Chinese. So what happened to the Chinese at the surrender ceremony? They weren't there because the Chinese had already brokered a separate peace with Japan. That's why Japanese troops and airships would be threatening the United States until the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, for years after 1945. Next. While the Soviets were signing this surrender ceremony, their troops were attacking Japan, so the whole surrender ceremony was abrogated. So at that moment, everyone knew it was a farce. You can't attack someone while signing a surrender ceremony. So at that point, it pretty much ended. This was one of the last battles of World War II where the Soviets were trying to invade Hokkaido and take the northern island. The Japanese defeated them soundly, and here's why. The Japanese had Navy tanks. They produced several hundred of these, and the Americans kept wondering, why did the Japanese build these amphibious tanks and we never ran into them once in the Pacific War? Because all of them were up north. And finally, that's what the Japanese tanks were confronted with. Basically, poor Soviets who were wearing lifesavers and paddles trying to reach the islands. And that's why the Soviets were massacred. They were able to get into Manchuria, but he stopped them in North Korea basically by blowing that bomb. As a matter of fact, the North Koreans, all of the atomic bombs that the Americans are constantly trying to negotiate with them about, are built from those factories left by the Japanese. And this is so important. This is Hirohito and MacArthur staying together. MacArthur was considered by the American High Command to be the Emperor's general and a Japanese stooge. Here's where Emperor Hirohito is paying Japanese laborers to say, pray for MacArthur's success in presidential elections. We, the Japanese people, want General MacArthur as the President of the United States. One of the things I had to destroy, one of the stranger items, was thousands of I Love Doug election buttons printed in Japanese. There used to be I Like Ike, there was I Love Doug, but that was all from this Japanese source financial campaign where Hirohito said, oh, I can make you president. Well, he lost really soundly, and pretty shortly after that, he pretty much died of a broken heart. But Truman, this is a telling picture. Here's a Japanese instrument of surrender. Here's Dewey Beats Truman is this headline that was also shown. Both of these are false. None of them means anything. Everything he was saying was just pretty much the Truman Show. The war continued legally until 1951. As a matter of fact, the peace treaty was signed. This is a horrible image of it, but hopefully we can get a better scan someday. But this is the Japanese, September 8th, 1951, San Francisco, representatives of 48 countries with Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida signs the Treaty of Peace with Japan. Yoshida also signed the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty the same day. So that was when Japan got all its concessions. Japan was able to open the U.S. markets, dominate the industry, and pretty much destroy American industry. This was when the Prime Minister was leaving. He got so many concessions. All of these guys from all of these third world countries were hailing him as a hero. They said, God, you actually won the war. That's when he was leaving San Francisco. So this took place at the Presidio where I worked. These photographs are available almost nowhere else. And so I was able to get some of these photos out where that peace treaty was signed at the Presidio military base, because that's where the United Nations was formed. It was formed at the Presidio military base of San Francisco. The war it was formed to fight ended there in San Francisco. So that's pretty much it. Yeah.
5 minutes. Can you start?
Oh, it's over now. Yeah, this is Emperor Hirohito. Basically did what he said he would do. He outlived Roosevelt, outlived Hitler, Mussolini, de Gaulle. He outlived Churchill. He outlived every single leader of World War II. He's 89 years old, standing there next to Reagan. So that's the end of that.
Can you bring up the debris issue before the 5 minutes is up?
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. Yes. So this was the debris that I was able to abscond with from the Roswell documents. So the reason that this is important is because this would be the equivalent. Historically, physically, you could never have, say, for instance, a piece of the atomic bomb. But the atomic bomb, because it disintegrated on impact, is not the kind of weapon you can show a piece of debris from. But with this weapon, which was essentially part of the dirigible that crashed over Roswell, that basically brought the war to a close, that forced the Americans into suing for peace and forced them later on into concessions after 5 years of talk down. This vehicle's, I don't know whether it's a part of the dirigible's framework, whether it's part of the bomber or one of the parasite fighters, but you're certainly welcome to hold it. I'll get the gloves out. The only problem is because it's paint, I don't want to damage it too much, but this is, what's so important about this is I offered this to Hakui City in Japan to bring back to the Japanese people, and so they invested $50 million in this. And thank you for bringing that up, because it is important to close with this. And what happened was that during that period of time that I was doing that and working with Teleport USA represented the Hakui City's banking and investments in Los Angeles, of all places. So when I worked anonymously with Teleport USA, and Hakui City invested over $50 million in building a UFO museum in Hakui City, Japan, this, believe it or not, was to be the centerpiece of the museum because it was Roswell debris. And when they did that, the Americans launched a disinformation campaign, and it started with Art Bell, and pretty much in November 17th of 1995 is when they announced about the UFO museum on Ken Schramm's town meeting. That was ufologist Robert Dean, and he announced it in the United States that the Japanese would open one in July of 1996. They'd open that museum. And then what happened with that was the Japanese offered this tourist package. They offered a convention. They wanted speakers there. Spectrographic analysis was going to prove that this was earthbound, because the spectrography of stars and galaxies throughout the universe proves that they all have the same elements we have on Earth, but to a different degree. So spectrographic analysis is like a fingerprint. You can tell if something is extraterrestrial. So during that period of time, on April 18th, 1996, while we were negotiating with Japan, Art Bell got Art's parts, sent to him anonymously. And Art Bell received real Roswell parts with a disinformation letter saying it's all aliens, they were all from outer space. Linda Moulton Howe came back with the results on May 19th, 1996. It was pure Japanese aluminum. That was basically Art's parts. And that was announced on the air. It was announced on the web, but it was part of a huge demotivation campaign, and was part of a campaign which led to political problems where Japan had to send this back to me. But they had a private ceremony so that survivors, the families of the Yakuza men who died at Roswell, were able to view this. And then it was sent back to me. So that was on June 12th, 1996, when Teleport USA announced that they were not going to have a UFO museum. They opened up a museum dedicated to space exploration instead, conventional space exploration. It's known as the Cosmo Isle Space Museum in Hakui City, Japan. But they held a private ceremony in which the families could view this. So I certainly hope that we can view this with the reverence and the respect that it deserves. That's why I bring out the gloves, so that you know, just human oils can get onto paint and kind of degrade it. Sure, and take a look at it. But do keep in mind it's like a version of the atomic bomb in that sense that it's part of a weapon that changed the world. And there were men who died to end that war. And it's got writing on it, similar to some of the hieroglyphics that Jesse Marceau Jr. saw. Art's parts were just like this. They were stiff. If you actually tried to bend them, they would break. But all of the memory metal that everyone remembers from those days was actually the asbestos-lined and rubberized silk. That was part of that dirigible. And the Americans, because they were trying to do a night run, because they didn't want to panic the population of New Mexico, sent the dirigible up in the air to carry the bomber airborne at night. And the Army wanted to see if they could use this weapon to hit Antarctica where the Navy failed. And when the Americans put it up in the air at night so no one could see it, a huge thunderstorm came up. The Japanese took advantage of it, self-immolated, and the Americans lost that particular secret weapon and that option. And, but they were ready in the sense that all of those same doctors who worked with the Manhattan Project, doctors familiar with radiation, all of those doctors were on hand in case that bomb went off. Everybody who worked for General Groves of the Manhattan Project, who was in the medical department, was there on hand in case that bomb went off. But at the Proctor site, they found that it had fused. It was inert. They brought it in. Certain engineers were saying, how does it fly? Obviously, that was never going to fly on its own because it's just a Fat Man bomb. But everybody was thinking that was a craft. Other people saw different aspects of the craft, huge amounts of debris field here, the craft here, but it all sourced from one point. And that's, that essentially puts it in perspective as to what happened with that. So in terms of what that was, it was collateral damage of the Second World War, which was still ongoing. And the Americans were willing to kill people to keep that secret shut down. And that's why children were separated from their parents, and they were told, your parents will die if you ever talk about this. Parents were separated from their children and told the same thing. The Air Force even hired hitmen to threaten people using mafia tactics. And the reason why was because they wanted, rather the U.S. Army Air Corps did this, they wanted that Air Force. Because now that they've got that Air Force, then you've got this black budget, which is not monitored by anybody. It is, it's an endless black hole where all the money is sunk into to develop weapons that are never deployed. Even the Air Force got rid of its strategic bombers and moved underground into missile silos, hundreds of feet underground, where they never took to the air anymore, Strategic Air Command. And you have to ask yourself, how do we let them get away with this? And it's because they keep pushing that myth, well, the atomic bomb ended the war. It's never been deployed since. It's never been deployed since because it didn't end the war. If it had ended the war, we would have ended Vietnam. We would have ended Korea. We would have ended Afghanistan. We would have ended Iraq. It's never been used again because they know it's useless and that it didn't do anything of strategic importance. It was simply an act of terror. And so that's what needs to be brought up as well. So, thank you so much.